Hello and welcome to this new episode of Free Science 365. Let me start with a question. What's your IQ? Now, I don't want to put you on the spot, but today we're going to talk about this very thing, the IQ test. So, over the past few days, I've asked people what phrase or picture comes to your mind when you hear the word intelligence. Almost everybody responded with one of two replies: Einstein and the IQ of a person. Most people consider Einstein as the person with the highest IQ ever. Also, most people think the best way of measuring the intelligence or smartness of a person is the IQ test. So, what is an IQ test? IQ stands for intelligence quotient. It's a number that one gets after they have attempted an IQ test. Now, this is a science channel, and so I can safely assume that most people who watch my videos have a higher degree of curiosity than normal people. So it's very probable that you, my viewer, might have done a paper-based IQ test or an online one. Basically, the IQ test consists of a set number of questions which must be answered in a set time. For example, 35 questions in 25 minutes. The questions have a lot of patterns, numbers, symbols, and pictures. Your task is to find either the next logical formation, or analogies of pair, or a missing pattern in the middle of a series of patterns. The attempter has to find the correct answer from a bunch of options, usually between 4 to 6 options, but it can vary. Once you're done, your answers are evaluated. If you are a child, your mental age compared to your chronological age is calculated. For example, if a 12-year-old kid attempts the IQ test and scores a score equivalent to the average score of a 16-year-old, then his mental age would be 16 years, although his chronological age is just 12 years. So his IQ score would be mental age divided by chronological age times 100. So in this case, it's 16, the mental age, divided by 12, the chronological age. You multiply this number with 100, and that gives you a score of 133. Such a kid would find it easy to do quadratic equations in mathematics, for example, while their classmates are still struggling with fractions and proportions. Now, if you're an adult, your IQ score bracket among people of your age is measured from a normalized distribution of IQ scores in your age group. 100 is considered to be the average IQ of an adult, so the number that you see in the middle of this Bell's curve is 100, and 50% of the population is considered to be below this score, and the rest 50% of the adults are above this score. So a score of, let's say, 133 for an adult will put you into the 98th percentile of the population. The term IQ has become an integral part of the popular culture in every modern community on Earth. But you might be surprised to know that the original IQ test was not created to check how smart a person is compared to the average person on the street. In fact, its purpose was the opposite. Yes, its purpose was to find how unsmart a school kid is compared to their peers. It all started in France. The year is 1882, and the French government made it mandatory for every child between the ages of 6 and 14 to attend school. For the first time, pupils came from all social classes and represented all economic levels. In 1904, the French Ministry of Education asked psychologist Alfred Binet to devise a method that would determine which students did not learn from the regular classroom instruction. The idea was to identify the so-called slow learners so that they could be given extra help. As a result, in 1905, Binet, along with Theodore Simon, introduced a new test for measuring intelligence of school children. This test was called the Binet-Simon scale. The purpose of this scale of normal functioning was to compare children's mental abilities relative to those of their normal peers. The scale consisted of 30 tasks of increasing difficulty. The score on the Binet-Simon scale revealed the child's mental age. So basically, there were two purposes of the Binet-Simon scale. First, measure the mental abilities of school children, not adults, school children. And second, measure the mental age of a child below their normal chronological age, so that they could be given extra help to learn things they were supposed to learn. So naturally then, the question has to be asked, how did it all metamorphose into the IQ test of today that actually measures how smart a person is instead of how unsmart a person is? Enters Stanford psychologist Lewis M. Terman. Lewis M. Terman created the classic IQ test and marketed his product to the maximum that he could. Terman strongly believed that all children and adults should be tested on his IQ test. He took a teaching job at Stanford in 1910. Now, Stanford was not today's Stanford in 1910. Stanford was not as reputed back then. Interestingly enough, it was Terman who made Stanford more popular. How? Well, Terman translated into English the original intelligence test devised by Alfred Binet and Theodore Simon. Remember, the Binet-Simon scale had been developed to identify mentally below-average children in the French school system. Well, Terman very cleverly made a few changes to the original Binet-Simon scale. 3 of them are worth mentioning here. First, he added harder items to the original Binet-Simon scale so that he could market it to the school districts to identify gifted children. Second, he added even harder questions so that he could then market his product to companies claiming that they could identify gifted adults. Third, he named the test the Stanford Revision and Extension of Binet's Intelligence Scale, shortened to Stanford-Binet test, which it is now known as. The first version was published in 1916. It is still being used today, although many changes have been made, but it's still being used today. Now, after administering his IQ test to a good number of people, Terman discovered 2 things. First, girls scored higher than boys. Second, whites scored higher than blacks, Hispanics, and other minorities. Now, about the fact that girls were scoring better than boys, Terman took it as a problem in the test. But about the second finding, that the whites were scoring higher than blacks, Hispanics, and other communities, he didn't see it as a problem. To Terman, this was just a reality of his time. So what did he do? What he did was nothing short of alarming by today's standards. So what he did was he deleted the type of questions that girls were doing better on and added questions that boys were doing better on. So in this way, he normalized the test. But about the whites versus other ethnicities, Terman did nothing because he also believed that whites are smarter than blacks, Hispanics, and others. It was only in the late 1930s, after 1935, 36, 37, that Terman stopped publicly supporting his IQ test as a scientific, quote-unquote, proof of the racial supremacy of whites. Nobody knows why, but the most probable reason is that he saw the horrible consequences of his line of thinking in the Nazi Germany of Hitler. Anyways, the IQ test, conforming to the false but prevailing social assumptions of his time, became more famous after they were used in US military recruitment in 1917. Around 1.5 million military recruits took the IQ test. This made the IQ test wildly popular among the general public because it was claimed that the IQ tests helped America win the war. Of course, with so many IQ tests administered in schools and military and private companies, Terman became a very wealthy man. Now, this is what happens when you change a social norm, i.e. Binet's method to identify and help slower children in the French public school system, to a market norm, i.e. using the same Binet's method and selling it to schools and corporates for a profit. Whenever we change a social norm to a market norm without considering the medium to long-term consequences, it often results in a Cobra effect event. If you want to know more about Cobra effects, you can watch here. Anyways, coming back to Terman, he imagined America as a truly meritocratic society where IQ tests would determine who does what. In his ideal world, a higher IQ person would run a big corporation and a lower IQ person would do menial tasks. But doesn't that remind you of the plotline of books like Brave New World by Aldous Huxley? Anyways, so Terman wanted to prove to the world that the gifted children with very high scores on his IQ test were indeed going to be great successes in their lives. In 1921, he started his study on gifted children. He called it the genetic studies of genius. Terman started his study on 1,000 gifted children, and he called it the genetic studies of genius. In 1928, he added 528 more gifted children. So in total, he observed 1,528 gifted children over the years. And the study has continued to this date. Most participants have passed away, but a few are still around. And so I suppose the study will go as long as the last person in the original cohort of 1,528 children is alive. Now, 98% of all the participants in this study were whites, and most of them came from well-to-do families. Now, ideally, Terman should have just observed and followed the lives of these 1,528 gifted children. He shouldn't have interfered or intervened with their lives in any way, but Terman did intervene in the lives of his subjects. He wrote letters of recommendation so that his subjects could get better jobs. He gave personal advice to these subjects. He helped some of them get into college, pulling strings at Stanford to help them get admitted. These actions of Terman compromised the integrity of his study. Despite all this, you would imagine that, okay, he didn't play fair, but perhaps he was at least able to demonstrate that higher IQ children contributed to the society or were great successes in their lives. But despite all this, the majority of study participants' lives were very mundane and average. By the fourth volume of his Genetic Studies of Genius, Terman had noted that as adults his subjects pursued common occupations as humble as those of policeman, typist, and filing clerk. And he concluded, quote unquote, "At any rate, we have seen that intellect and achievement are far from perfectly correlated." So, even within his lifetime, Terman had realized that his hypothesis that the gifted children would be great successes in their lives was wrong. Very soon, schools and employers began to realize that IQ tests were not very effective in determining the future successes at schools and companies. In 1964, New York City decided to drop IQ testing in its schools. Soon, other schools decided the same. Also, in 1971, a Supreme Court decision banned IQ tests in most job hirings. So basically, the IQ score is not the real indicator of the true intelligence of a person. And more importantly, the IQ score of a person does not determine their future success. And that begs the question, what is real intelligence? How can we define intelligence in a better way? And can we measure the true intelligence of a person with a test? In our next episode, we'll discuss what we can define as true intelligence, or rather true intelligences. We'll also talk about how intelligence evolved, and more importantly, why it evolves in certain animals and creatures. I thank you for watching this video, and if you liked it, please press the like button. If you really liked it, please subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Until then, bye-bye.